It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience.
Hello again, everyone. We're back, and in this video, we're going to talk about Congress and specifically how powerful Congress might be relative to the other branches. We'll think a little bit about this system of checks and balances that gives Congress a number of different powers over the other branches, but also I think demonstrates that in some ways, though thought of as sort of the first branch of government, Congress is still weak in certain respects, and certainly something to talk about today, given the fact that we have an election coming up very soon, and we have right now sort of a conflict between a divided Congress and a president. Soon, a lot of that could change. So a lot of the political debates that are happening right now, I'm sure a lot of headlines you're seeing, I think tie into this very basic discussion that comes from the first article of the Constitution of the United States about what the Congress is and how it actually does things. So let's begin. Again, I want to stress, first of all, that the framers of the Constitution really thought of Congress as being the most powerful branch, and it's the place where they really put the most thought and they built in the most detail in terms of their discussion. And if you think about the judiciary in Article 3 of the Constitution, there's really not nearly as much description of exactly what it is and how it should operate. Congress, though, there were a lot of sort of specifics here. And so the first specific that we can think about in terms of the Continental Congress or the Constitutional Convention actually writing in these descriptions of the powers of Congress. The first one is Congress is given a substantial check on the power of presidents through a process called impeachment. Now, I'm sure that if you've been paying attention over the last couple of years, you are well aware of the fact that Congress, actually the House of Representatives, has in fact impeached Donald Trump. And you might be thinking to yourself, yet Donald Trump is still the president. I don't understand how that works. Well, that is because the word impeachment in common parlance, I think, is often thought of as meaning actually removal of the president, whereas impeachment is actually not the same thing as removal. Impeachment and removal are two separate processes. And so the way impeachment actually works, as described in Article 1 of the Constitution, is the House of Representatives, being this sort of lower chamber, is able to bring about charges of impeachment. They debate that and then they vote, essentially. And if they are able to pass the threshold for impeachment, then they will have essentially accused the president of some of these things: treason, bribery, or other high crimes. And this is one place in which the Constitution is actually quite vague, right? Treason, bribery, I mean, these are very, very vague descriptions. And in fact, in both the Trump impeachment process and in the Bill Clinton impeachment process, we saw that there were many different interpretations of what this meant by people on either side of that impeachment debate. Regardless, when we think about the most recent example, Trump is impeached by the House of Representatives. The vote is successful. But there's a second piece to this process that's described in the Constitution, whereby that impeachment is then, the articles of impeachment are then carried over to the Senate. And the Senate, of course, at the current moment being controlled by a majority of Republicans, actually ended up not going forward with the process of removal, essentially voting against the case for impeachment. And so you need both sides, both chambers of Congress, in order to successfully remove the president. And so that's one of the reasons why this process of actually removal from office is just so incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, the framers of the Constitution interpreted this as being a really strong check on the president because they saw this as being something that could happen in the case of any of this stuff, partially because they weren't thinking very carefully yet about the emergence of strong political parties and the idea that majorities of parties in Congress could have such a determinative impact on the vote for or against presidential misconduct. And so this is, again, one of the potential strengths of Congress, the idea that the Congress can impeach presidents. Importantly, not just presidents, but also vice presidents, other officials, right? So I know that maybe some people have been hearing in recent times discussion about whether Bill Barr, right, should be impeached. The Congress does have the power to do that. And so again, as we read these things, we should be thinking carefully, checking our notes with the U.S. Congress or the Constitution of the United States, and thinking to ourselves, is that something that the Congress can do, or is that something that the Congress cannot do based on the definition from the Constitution? In this case, that is absolutely the case. Congress can remove many of these different officials for these specific reasons. Congress also can engage, and this is one of the most important functions of Congress, in oversight over the executive branch and also other stakeholders in society. So here we have a big federal bureaucracy building. We can see that it's got this wonderful architectural style here and these little schoolhouses out in front. Right, this is the U.S. Department of Education. This is where a lot of policy is thought about, analyzed, and set relating to K-12 education, college education, all kinds of different educational priorities in the United States. Currently, this department is overseen by a fairly controversial political nominee whose name is Betsy DeVos. You might have heard of her before. She's been in the news because many of the initiatives that she has been trying to enforce at the Department of Education have been fairly controversial relative to previous Department of Education chiefs in the past. And so one of the things that Congress can do in order to sort of investigate what's going on in that bureaucracy, which is, of course, something that exists in the executive branch, not in the Congress itself, right? This is a separate institution. We're, again, checking on the power of a different branch of government. This oversight can happen in which Betsy DeVos or other officials of the Department of Education can be called forth to testify in front of Congress. You might have seen videos of this, right, where Congress, in committees, for example, convene these panels and they grill these people all the time. One notable one in recent times was, for example, Hillary Clinton was grilled by this special commission to investigate Benghazi, and we saw that she endured dozens of hours of questioning from especially Republicans, in these committees. This kind of oversight, right, is one of the powers of Congress, and it's one of the ways in which they can understand what's going on in these various departments, what's going on in these various bureaucracies, and potentially given the findings of their investigations, do things like pass new laws that advise those bureaucracies to take different tacks and other kinds of actions. So, of course, this is a strong check again on the power of the president, who again appoints many of these individuals to serve in as the political chiefs of these different federal bureaucracies. It does not, however, mean that the Congress, has some sort of unlimited power over the president. We already talked about the fact that actually impeachment is a very difficult thing to, actually succeed at, or at least remove from office, is an extraordinarily, high hurdle. Actually, maybe more difficult than the framers of the Constitution intended. And also, this oversight of the bureaucracies is not, a foolproof way to sort of stop malfeasance or to stop, certain kinds of actions by members of the bureaucracy. So we'll see some ways in which the president and the executive branch can push back against Congress in another video. So stay tuned for that. But you can really see, I think, already that there are a substantial number of overlapping and, conflicting powers in both Congress and the executive branch. Another way in which these powers are overlapping and conflicting is when it comes to foreign affairs. So we can think of the Senate as being especially this sort of foreign-facing body, right? They're the body that thinks, the most about diplomacy and the United States' relationship with other countries. And so they have this kind of overlapping power where Congress can vote on treaties with other nations. They can actually vote to, uphold specific treaties that are approved by foreign powers as well. However, the president can do sort of an analogous thing, which is called an executive agreement, which is more of a unilateral sort of head of state to head of state kind of relationship where they can agree to do something. And so you can see that those serve similar functions, but are coming from different branches of government. The Senate can check these executive agreements. They can modify or cancel those agreements with a 2/3 vote. However, again, if we think realistically or pragmatically about the powers of of Congress vis-a-vis the president, a 2/3 vote, right? That's 67 senators. Getting to 67 in a very polarized, gridlocked Congress, that's essentially saying that if you're the Republicans, you need to get a large number of dozen plus Democrats on your side. If you're the Democrats, dozen plus Republicans on your side. That's really, really hard in today's polarized politics. Again, also another place where Congress and the president have sort of sparred over the years is the idea that Congress is, according to the Constitution, the sole originator of declarations of war. However, over the years, we've seen examples where presidents have unilaterally declared military interventions in foreign countries, put troops in various places without the consent of Congress. And we've seen that Congress has, in many cases, gotten very upset about that and sort of censored the president. And yet the president has sort of consistently ignored that those directives and has ended up continuing to do those types of foreign interventions. And so again, we can see here where even though there's hard checks and balances that are determined by the Constitution, we also see where those powers start to blur a little bit, and there are real conflicts between the branches over who's responsible for what. Another thing that we should really think about is this idea of a veto. Right, we know that Congress has the ability to originate legislation. This is where these bills come from, where our friend Bill from the Schoolhouse Rock video came from. Right, the legislation is sponsored by and originates with either members of the House of Representatives or senators, and it does not originate with the president. Right, the president cannot write a bill and then give it to Congress to look at and eventually pass. Those members of Congress are actually the ones who originate the legislation, even though they might be strongly aligned with the president's preferences and the president's initiatives. So at the end of that process, the president can also provide a check on these pieces of original legislation that come from Congress. They can veto legislation. And so, of course, Congress can override a veto, again, with a 2/3 majority in both houses. But again, if we think about the modern Congress, that's a really hard thing to do. We have very rarely seen examples of where a presidential veto gets overridden. Only a couple of recent examples that we can think of. And that's partially, again, because the president can just simply refuse to sign this bill into law. We also have the idea of a pocket veto, where the president doesn't even need to actually formally veto legislation. They can simply let the bill expire on their desk. Essentially, this 2/3 majority to undo what the president has done with the pocket veto or with the formal veto, in this case, it's really, really hard in reality to actually do this. So again, this is a strong check on Congress that the president has in modern times. Finally, I think one thing we really want to think about is the idea of judicial review. And certainly you can read in your text and you can look at the specifics of Marbury versus Madison, which is a key Supreme Court case in 1803, one of the earlier actual Supreme Court cases in which the majority of the court in Marbury actually finds that essentially support for the judicial idea that the court is capable of reviewing legislation that comes from Congress and is able to rule on whether it is in keeping with the text of the Constitution or whether it is unconstitutional. So in our discussion of civil rights and liberties, we already saw an example of that, right? Where in 1875, we had this sweeping piece of legislation, this suite of laws that would have gone into effect, that would have essentially ended the practice of segregation in the South before it even began, really, right? It would have actually put teeth, as we saw, like real punishments and real fines for engaging in practices of discrimination in terms of public conveyances and staying in inns and stuff, right? It would have actually broken down that color barrier in the South really quickly. And nevertheless, the Supreme Court, in a sort of a famously prejudicial determination or prejudicial ruling, found that this Civil Rights Act in the 1870s was unconstitutional, which would usher in many, many decades of segregation in the South and many, many other forms of de facto discrimination. So these kinds of decisions, judicial review, can be extremely consequential. We have many examples, in modern history as well, of Congress passing laws that the Supreme Court essentially says, nope, sorry, Constitution forbids you from doing that, right? You could imagine, some kind of law that they could pass, which would be a direct infringement on the First Amendment. Like imagine that Congress decided tomorrow to pass a law that said that, no one can, no one can print an op-ed in a newspaper anymore, like barring the existence of op-eds or something. You must be on the payroll of a newspaper in order to publish anything in a newspaper. That's a clear violation of the First Amendment, which protects both the right or the freedom of speech, liberty of freedom of speech, but also the freedom of the press, right? And so those would be clear violations of the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court could intervene and say, no, that law is off the books, strike it from the record. We do not believe that it accords with the fundamental rules of the Constitution. So there's all kinds of different powers and checks on Congress that make this institution just an incredibly powerful thing, but also in many ways very weak, right? Especially in the consequence of divided government. So we see, for example, what happens when we've got a unified House and Senate. It's much more likely to pass laws, right? We saw, for example, in the first term of the Obama administration. Right, we saw that Democrats controlled all the branches of government. We had a Democratic president in Barack Obama. We had a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House at some point in that administration. And what happens? We get this sweeping healthcare reform, right? The Affordable Care Act, which nevertheless there were still a number of different compromises that needed to be made in order to get that legislation passed with Republicans. But it was a huge initiative, and it really, really changed the landscape of healthcare in America. In today's Congress, though, we have obviously a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. Getting that passed, it seems almost inconceivable when we don't have all of these different pieces of government all united behind one political party. And so in the future, I think one of the consequences of the 2020 election is to ask whether or not we're going to have unified or divided government in the future. Because given the fact that Congress is so complicated and has so many checks on its power, that is where we're going to see the most fireworks in the 2020 to 2024 legislative cycles. If we still have divided government, it's unlikely that a lot of stuff is going to get passed. It's unlikely that consequential or sort of liberal or conservative legislation will actually go through Congress. However, if we have unified government, be it either the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on what happens in the election, that's when you're going to start to see consequential legislation come through. And so it'll be very important and interesting for us to observe what happens in this election, because the stakes are essentially what happens when bills are trying to become laws. So stay tuned for that. I look forward to our discussion this week about Congress. And until then, I wish you a happy week, and I'll see you then.